So welcome everyone. I see we have 80 participants right now. Excellent, wonderful audience. Let me just say a few words and welcome you to the Jean and Denis Sinor Faculty Fellowship Lecture. This is a distinguished lecture series and faculty fellowship endowed by the late Professor Denis Sinor to perpetuate his legacy in Central Eurasian studies, with the goal of bringing in very distinguished faculty from around the world. Until recently, we have been able to do this in person. This year, due to the pandemic, it has been a virtual occurrence, but we always hope that we can bring these lecturers back in future in person. Usually it's 3 to 4 days on campus, meeting with faculty, meeting with students, presenting this distinguished lecture, talking in classrooms, meeting the students in person, but well, now we will do it all virtually. Also, the lecture is being recorded and will be placed on the SUS website and through other SUS electronic media. Now, past lecturers, past Jean and Denis Sinor faculty lecturers have included Mark Elliott from Harvard, Dan Potts from NYU, Richard Bullitt from Columbia, Carl Ernst from the University of North Carolina, Victor Meyer, who's here today from the University of Pennsylvania, Chris Atwood, formerly from Indiana University from the SUS department, now at Penn. And for the remainder of this semester, there will be 2 more virtual lectures in this series. Nicola De Cosmo from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and then finally, Cynthia Buckley from the University of Illinois. So with that having been said, let us all give a great welcome to Professor Grenet from the Collège de France, who is coming to us, I believe, from Paris today.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I'm speaking from Paris.
Wonderful. So it's evening time and I don't see that glass of wine next to you, but
it will come next.
It will come later. Fair enough, fair enough. So Professor Grenet specializes on the history and archaeology of Central Asia. Among his accomplishments, he's been the deputy director of the French archaeological delegation in Afghanistan from 1997 to 1981. Director of the French Uzbek Archaeological Mission in Sogdiana from 1989 to 2014. He's led field missions in Afghanistan in 2004 and 2012. And since 2013, he's professor at the Collège de France, chair of history and culture of pre-Islamic Central Asia. Professor Grenet is also a member of the American Philosophical Society, the oldest of the elite societies in the United States. He's president for the Association for the Advancement of Iranian Studies in Paris, and he's an honorary citizen of Samarkand. Bravo, bravo. He co-authored with the late Professor Mary Boyce the 3rd volume on the history of Zoroastrianism, Zoroastrianism under Macedonian and Roman rule. And he's in the process of editing 7 volumes with Nicholas Sims Williams, Early Sogdian Inscriptions and Documents. That having been said, I should point out that we are greatly honored that you join us today as the Jean and Denis Sinor lecturer. And we look forward very much to your presentation, which is titled Religious Coexistence in Central Asia, circa the year 1000 of the Common Era. Professor Grenet, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chokski. First, I wish to express some words of gratitude for this very kind invitation, which comes as a great honor. I had the privilege of meeting Professor Sinor several times, and for us in Paris, he was a legend because he was probably the last surviving pupil of the great Paul Pelliot, who was teaching at Central Asia at the Collège de France until 1949. Where, of course, the achievements of the University of Indiana in the field of Central Asian studies is well known, I had myself the privilege of meeting several teachers here, you, Professor Shopsi, Ron Sela, whom I had the pleasure to meet at a meeting in Leiden, Christopher Beckwith also, but I can see probably today very few, if at all, universities in the world who can offer such a panel of teaching on Central Asia, be it archaeology, history, philology, linguistics, anthropology. I remember in the late 1880s, when we were beginning working in Uzbekistan, the only tool we had to try to access the Uzbek language was a handbook by Arlo Raun, if I remember well, on the Uzbek language, produced by the University of Indiana. So this is a long history, and I look forward to future achievements. So now to the text of my lecture. It has been already announced that I have chosen a topic which enables to examine the religious picture in a very broad perspective, with the focus on a particularly important moment. I think around year 1000. It's not just for the beauty of the round figure. It is also because this is really a very important time, a time of when religious coexistence in Central Asia was probably at its peak. So let us start with a story. Excuse me, I share the screen. Excuse me, yes. Well, a small manipulation. Okay, do you see my slide?
No, sir, we don't.
You don't, okay. I have to go back to screen share. Oh, so do you?
Yes, we do, excellent.
Okay, so let me go to the first one. In 1007, somewhere in Mongolia, not far from the caravan route which ran along the north of the Gobi Desert, the king of a nomadic people, Turk or Mongol, got lost in the mountain while hunting. About to succumb to exhaustion, he had a vision of Saint Sergius. Returning to his camp, he met a party of Christian merchants who probably had come from Turfan or perhaps Transoxiana, Samarkand. Whoever they were, they put him in touch with the metropolitan bishop of Merv, the city which for 6 centuries had been the starting point of the Christian mission in Central Asia. Then came an exchange of letters between the bishop of Merv here and the patriarch of Baghdad. The patriarch gave permission to send a priest and a deacon, while trying to find a way to observe the Eucharist and Lent in a country lacking wheat and wine. The king was baptized together with 200,000 of his people. This was by then the main success ever won by the Nestorian Church of the East, after the glorious but short-lived episode of the first Chinese Christianity between 635 and 845. In order, however, to accept this story, one has to give credence to the Syriac polygraphist Bar Hebraeus, who related it in his 2 chronicles, composed later on at the Mongol court of Iran. And here, according to some, doubts arise. Bar Hebraeus identifies the converted king, I would rather say Khan, as a sovereign of the Karaite people, an ancestor of Turil Ongkhan, Genghis Khan's first ally in his rise to power, and in the West, one of the sources of the myth of Priest John. Several Christian Karaite princesses had married Genghis Khanate princes. One of them, Surga was the mother of the Greek Khans Monka and Kubilai. Excuse me, I can't reach my next slide. Yeah. The mother of Greek Khan Monka and Kubilai, and also of Hulegu, Ilkhan of Persia. They all protected the Christians without being Christian themselves. So, did Bar-Hebraeus, by flattery, interpolate in this account the name of the Karaites? The hypothesis goes back to Paul Pelliot and is still generally accepted. For my part, I must admit that I see no decisive reason to deny the account. If we reject the identification, we must also reject the story as a whole and admit that Bar-Hebraeus frauded the patriarchal correspondence to which he had access. One also has to neglect the fact that among all the nomadic peoples of the region at that time, the Karaite are the only one where Christian royal names are attested continuously since the late 11th century. If these people were actually the Karaite, as I believe, the consequences of this conversion were felt for more than 3 centuries, until the Islamization of the Mongols in Persia and Transoxiana and the fall of the Mongols in China. Besides the Christians, 2 other minority religions show at the same time a surprising vitality on the northeastern fringes of the Islamic world. One of these religions is Manichais. Since its foundation in the 3rd century, and despite persecutions, this universal church, strictly hierarchized with the numerous clauses at all levels, was in Babylonia. In the early 10th century, under the Caliph al-Muqtadir, 500 Manichaeans were expelled from Baghdad, and together with their supreme head, the Archegos, they migrated to Samarkand, where a community existed already. This move was the result of a vigorous diplomatic intervention by the then officially Manichaean Uyghur kingdom of Turfan. Since very recently, thanks to Yutaka Yoshida, who republished Manichaean letter found in Turfan, we know that in about 1000, the Archegos transferred there his seat from Samarkand, leaving a community behind him. For several decades, the axis Samarkand-Turfan became the main artery of Manichaeism in the world. The third minority religion which shows much activity in this period is Judaism. For a long time, historians have known the very ample commercial network of the Jewish Ravania merchants, a name which probably means those who know the roads. According to a 9th century account, this network controlled several itineraries linking by land and sea the lower Rhône Valley in France with China, across the steppe to the north of the Black Sea, and across Central Asia. We know also that under the influence of Jewish merchants, the Turkish aristocracy of the Khazar kingdom had adopted Judaism as state religion. But what for a long time had remained unsuspected is the existence deep in the Afghan mountains here of sizable Jewish communities, self-organized and at the same time well integrated into the regional power networks. They come to the fore shortly after year 1000, thanks to 2 sets of documents, the funerary inscriptions of Rur, and very recently discovered, the several hundreds of paper documents designated as the Afghan Genizah. In fact, by the diversity of genres and languages, as well as by their documentary interest, they can be compared to the famous Cairo Genizah. Surprising vitality, I have said, for these 3 religions. When one speaks about Central Asia around the year 1000, one rather bears in mind the consolidation of Islam there after the first century of Hijrah, and concerning Northwest India, its new expansion 4 centuries later, which has been called the Second Conquest. As early as the mid-8th century, problem with this slide. Excuse me. Yes, as early as the mid-8th century, Islam had reached far and wide in the steppe by commercial penetration, by raids of volunteers of the faith, then by military operations carried out by the Samanids, the very same rulers who had been obliged to accept the exiled Manichaeans. In 893, the Samanids captured Taraz here, the western capital of the Karluks of Semirechye, between present Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. This Karluk had been partly Christianized. The cathedral in Taraz was turned into a mosque. Here is a Karluk tombstone with a Nestorian cross and 3 praying ladies with a marked Turkish physical type. The Karakhanids, who succeed the Karluks, start the Islamization of eastern Turkestan, while the Ghaznavids undertake the conquest of northern India. In the Hindu Kush mountains, the last independent kingdoms disappear by a progressive erosion. Buddhism is extinct in around the year 1000, in Bamiyan as well as in Kabul. The other great religion which had held central stage in pre-Islamic Central Asia, namely Zoroastrianism in its local variants, a theme I am going to address tomorrow, is rapidly confined to a discrete existence, much more so than in Iran. The communities remain tolerated locally for their competence in irrigation techniques. Otherwise, they contribute to the migration to India or melt into sectarian trends of Islam. The extinction or quasi-extinction of Buddhism and Zoroastrianism makes the survival and sometimes even expansion of Judaism, Christianity, and Manichaism in Central Asia all the more surprising. And yet, let us now look again at the new documents that shed light on these communities. I begin with the Jews, the first arrived in Central Asia, probably since antiquity, although concrete data are lacking until the 5th century. They appear to have gained much influence in the Hephthalite Empire of the 5th, 6th centuries. An eloquent testimony has been identified recently by Ankadan and myself. A silver bowl now in Tokyo, previously published as an illustration of a scene from the Iliad, in fact depicts 2 episodes from the Alexander romance. Alexander drinking at the fountain of immortality, and Alexander gathering incense bowls in the sacred wood. But these images illustrate the Jewish version of the story, not the Greek nor the Iranian one. Alexander is circumcised. We can also consider a Jewish attribution for a 9th century plate from Merv, closer to the period, which is our focus today, showing David, Solomon, and Bathsheba. In the early Abbasid period, the existence of Jewish communities in several towns, especially Merv and Balkh, is established by the eminent role played in Baghdad by scholars from these towns, either Jewish or Jewish converts. A great surprise occurred in 1963 with the discovery of a large Jewish cemetery in a place where it was hardly expected, namely Firuzkoh, the ephemeral capital of the Ghurib dynasty, landlocked in the mountains. Today, practically only the famous Jam minaret subsists, probably, alas, not for a long time. At present, 74 inscriptions and tombstones have been published. They are composed in Judeo-Persian, an archaic form of Persian transcribed in Hebrew characters. Their content is brief, but reveals the existence of several functions: goldsmiths, traders, ministers of the cult, Levites and Kohens.
Hi, Patrick.
How are you doing, Lucy? It's been a while.
I know.
Sorry?
It's been a long time. I'm kind of shaky.
Why?
Sorry about that interruption, Frantz. Please go ahead. It was clearly someone in the audience. Frantz, you need to unmute. Professor Grenet, you are muted.
Is it okay now?
Yes, now it's okay. Yes.
We find also the title Nashi and Rosak Kahal, two titles designating the lay leaders of the Jewish community. What were they doing in these mountains in such great numbers? After Firuzko was established as imperial capital, one can assume that the court attracted merchants and craftsmen, but the series of inscriptions starts in 1012, more than 1 century before. At that time, the only wealth Gore was credited with was slaves captured among non-Islamized mountain people. But we have no indication of an involvement of the Jewish community in this trade there, contrary to the Ravania merchants in Europe. A legendary account on the ancestor of the Rudids presents a Jewish merchant who tells the art of conversation to the poorly educated local leader before he meets the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. He manages to please the Caliph, and consequently, he is officially invested as king of his people. We meet a similar figure of a Jewish civilizing hero in the Chronicle of Samarkand, where a Jew coming from Chinese Turkestan is reported to have instructed local people in the art of building aqueducts. Slightly more to the east, still in the Hindu Kush mountains, the so-called Afghan Genizah appeared a few years ago on the international antique market. The circumstances of the discovery have been kept secret, but it seems that these documents, dating from the first half of the 11th century, were found in a cave in the Bamiyan region. Their study is complicated as the main purchaser is apparently in jail in Russia and is raising the stakes in order to pay his lawyers. The National Library of Israel is trying to acquire the documents. Several have been published by Shaul Shaked and Ophir Haim. We are dealing with a private archive which belonged to a family of great merchants and landlords, the hereditary leaders of the local community. One finds mainly commercial receipts, correspondence, but also biblical commentaries, and original literary compositions, including a versified refutation of Hiwi al-Balkhi, a freethinker from Balkh. The languages are Persian, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic. Arabic and Persian are often noted in Hebrew script, as here. The important presence of the Arab language and of works composed in Iraq leads to the supposition that this community, or at least its leading family, originally came from there. Nevertheless, they appear well integrated in the local milieu, both economically and culturally. Tax receipts could indicate that these community leaders collected taxes from their co-religionists for the Ghaznavid administration. One prominent member of the family has settled in Ghazna, where he seems to be in business with the court. In a remarkable syncretism, a funerary hymn composed in Judeo-Persian draws the memory of Bible prophets together with Quranic figures. Christians and Manichaeans had arrived in Central Asia at about the same time, in the 1st century, long after the Jews, and 2 centuries after the first Buddhist monks. As I said in the beginning, the first focus of Christian missionary activity was Merv, then the main stronghold of the Sasanian Empire during its eastern campaigns. In the 5th century, the metropolitan seat of Merv affiliated with the Nestorian Church, like the majority of the churches of Persia. The map of bishop seats shows central Iran quite sparsely occupied between the Nestorian cradle of Upper Mesopotamia and its extension, and on another hand, a northeastern pole in Merv with offshoots far beyond the Dar al-Islam in the steppes and temporarily in Tibet and northern China. I have already mentioned the most advanced success gained in 1007, the conversion of the Karaits. Now, I would like to draw attention to the Samarkand Christendom on the basis of new documents. We knew already that Samarkand had been promoted as metropolitan seat in the 7th or 8th century, and that in the Mongol period, it was one of the sources of the clergy sent to China, including Mar Sargis, governor of Chengqing on the Yangtze, from whom Marco Polo, who never passed through Samarkand, drew all his information on that city. At the end of the 10th century, the Arab geographer Ibn Hawqal describes near Samarkand a kind of Thebaid increased by migrants from Iraq. I quote, "On Chowdar, the Piedmont south of Samarkand, there is a monastery of the Christians where they gather and have their cells. I found many Iraqi Christians there who migrated to the place because of its suitability, solitary location, and healthiness. It has inalienable properties, and many Christians retreat to it. This place towers over the major part of Sogd and is known as Wazgird. We know where it is, near the town of Urgut, 30 kilometers south of Samarkand. A church was excavated in the 90s. The plan is typical of Nestorian churches, with 2 L's, here and here, separated by a central platform, a bema. The datable material points to the 10th, 13th century. In a parallel valley, the cliff wall and small cavities for meditation carry pilgrims' inscriptions. This is actually me meditating in a cave. First reported in 1920, these inscriptions were fully published 4 years ago by Mark Dicketts, who gathered 167 inscriptions of various lengths. These inscriptions are purposely very discreet. When approaching, one sees only crosses. Excuse me. Yes. Here, very discreet. The only inscription which is conspicuous reads, "Moses is in grace." Is he the prophet rather than a pilgrim so named? If so, he could be Moses, present in Jesus' mandorla at the Transfiguration, the Urgut cliff being assimilated to the Sinai. Other inscriptions are pilgrims' records, lightly engraved or just scratched. In a few cases, painted. Typical formulas are Hosanna, may the sinner Yohanan have mercy in peace. So-and-so did the vigil. So-and-so made the sign of the living cross. So-and-so asks to be remembered. Some visitors are priests, including a mefashkana, interpreter of the scripture. Although none is explicitly designated as a monk, the absence of female names seems to indicate that women had no access to the site. Two dates can be read, 752 and 1247, which seems to frame the global chronology of the site. All the inscriptions are in Syriac, except one in Uyghur. The same identity choice is reflected by the onomastics. Among 50 personal names, 26 are Syriac, 10 Persian, 8 Arab, 6 Turk. The Arab names could belong to migrants from Iraq or represent the normal amount of Arab names in a Persian-speaking milieu. Syriac names prevail. Again, some could have belonged to Iraqi migrants, but they could also betray a choice by local pilgrims, reflecting the strong Syriac identity assumed by the Church of the East since Timothy, Patriarch of Baghdad, in 780-823. Timothy had reaffirmed the status of Syriac as language of paradise, and he has paid special attention to his easternmost diocese, being conscious that no resort in Christianity was as large as his. An indication of exchanges between Samarkand and the historical centers of the Nestorian Church is a Syrian or Iraqi bronze censer dating from this period and discovered at Urgut. But at the same time, the Urgut inscriptions show to which extent this effort to maintain the language was artificial. Many mistakes in the script, spelling, and syntax prove that the great majority of those who wrote the inscriptions were not native speakers. Besides the Christians, and probably in competition with them for their recruitments, Manichaeans were an important component of religious life at Samarkand in the 10th century and beyond. Yutaka Yoshida has recently reattributed to Samarkand some documents written in Sogdian, found in Turfan by the German expedition in the early 20th century. The first set of documents comprises 2 private letters, which were previously dated to before 880. Yoshida reattributes them to the 10th century and recognizes allusions to the recent immigration of Manichaeans expelled from Baghdad and now conducting their intrigues between Samarkand and Turfan. The absence of Uyghur name indicate that these letters were addressed from Samarkand. The plaintiffs are elects belonging to the community installed in Samarkand before the arrival of the Iraqis, who are contemptuously called Syrians. In their correspondence with the Turfan religious leaders, the Samarkand elects continue to use the Sogdian language. This is lively narrative Sogdian, the use of which is an exception at a time when the geographer Al-Muqaddasi considered this language extinct in cities. Some extracts. Letter 2. The custom and art of these dirty, mean Syrians is so. They are experienced and practiced in division and strife because the spirit of division rules them. Letter 1. The sisters saw their female elect took a hoe and dug the earth. They crushed herbs and also saw trees and wood without fear. Then our female elects also saw their female elect took blood and washed the knife with water. And our female elects complained. They answered so, water from the well is dead, for it is stagnant. Therefore it is permitted. And they even extinguished the fire themselves. Because their leader, who is Mir Padar, was ill, he had an illness in the lower regions, a rented girl went to him, and later she came out. Suspicion overcame all of us. Questioned by your elects, she answered, twice I took blood at the rear door, and once more I will take it. All these accusations aim to insinuate that the Manichaeans freshly arrived from Iraq do not respect the purity rules with the natural elements containing the particles of light of the souls to save. In the case of the servant girl, it is also suggested that her contact with the leader of the Baghdadi community is not only medical. There are also 3 letters recently discovered in a case at Bezeklik, near Turfan, and also published by Yoshida. Like the other ones, they are written in Sogdian script and not in the specific Manichaean script, but they are very different from them. Here we have official messages, beautifully illuminated, sent to the Mojak of the East residing in Turfan. His title, usually translated apostle or teacher, is the 2nd grade of the Manichaean hierarchy. But Yoshida, with sound arguments, supposes that in the present case, it designates the supreme leader of the world Manichaean church, freshly relocated in Turfan. Because the letter mentions some characters attested in Turfan in the early 11th century, he dates the letters to this period, the twilight of Manichaeism in the Uyghur Empire. They were sent on the occasion of the New Year festival, and contrary to those I have previously discussed, they are almost devoid of any informative content. One finds only laudatory formulas, vows from various members of the community, and a recapitulation of the religious offices which have been solemnized. To read them, one wonders why they were written at all. In a personal conversation, Jean-Daniel Dubois suggested that they were meant to accompany money transfers. The language, hieratic and antiquated, full of ready-made formulas, does not betray a colloquial use of Sogdian, contrary to the private letters from the previous century. Letter B is especially interesting for us. It is addressed from a place called Toothkat. Only one place with this name is known, at a short distance north of Samarkand. The librarian Ibn al-Nadim, to whom we owe the information on the immigration of Manichaeans from Baghdad, indicates as their new seat in Sogdiana a town which name can be read accordingly. If so, the Manichaeans of Samarkand, like the Christian, would have resided at some distance from the town, away from too direct vision of the Muslim masters. It is now appropriate to propose some general considerations about the religious communities and the documents which shed light on them. In a lecture delivered in Samarkand some years ago, Michel Tardieu, my former colleague at the Collège de France, qualified this period and this place as a rare oasis of religious peace. One should be conscious, however, that such retrospective enthusiasm should sometimes be moderated when analyzing the actual records. That is enough to consider how the supposed idyll of the 3 cultures of Andalus is reconsidered by recent historians. The demographic importance of these minorities is impossible to quantify due to lack of archival documents of the payment of the poll tax by infidels. Archaeologists can only form impressions based on the duration of cemeteries, be it the Jewish cemetery at Firuzko or the Nestorian cemeteries of the Karluk country. All figures given in contemporary texts are propaganda. We can notice, however, that the 200,000 Karaite converts mentioned by Bar Hebraeus are not disproportionate to the 80,000 souls John of Montecorvino, Catholic bishop of Peking in the Mongol period, would have converted but for the hostility of the Nestorians, according to his letter to the Pope. One can mention here the testimony of Benjamin of Tudela, written in about 1170, but of great retrospective interest. On the basis of information provided by a rabbi from Shiraz, he also gives fantastic figures. 50,000 Jews in Samarkand, which actually was the total population of the town. But besides this, some details on the towns and great boroughs of the Jews in the mountains, their agricultural activities, their self-administration, the presence of Levites, sound strangely right when compared with the now available information on the communities in the Hindu Kush. The global impression, even taking into account the exaggerations of propaganda, is that these minorities were a substantial proportion of the Central Asian population, itself in the middle of a demographic and economical optimum. It clearly appears that the Central Asian context of this time, a commercial crossroads and a place of concentration of huge spoils acquired by new bellicose dynasties, provided economical niches to communities well connected internationally, less constrained by Islamic law, and foreign to the sectarian violence which was absorbing more and more the energy of Islam in Iran and Central Asia. This is obvious for the Jews, very probable for the Christians, while the Manichaean Church was sometimes suspected to be the cover of a bank network. The intellectual vitality of these communities is, however, quite contrasted. The owners of the Bamiyan archive are intellectuals, connoisseurs of the emerging Persian literature, and at the same time, interested in the Jewish exegetic quarrels. They seem to show sympathy for the Karaite trend, calling for a free interpretation of the Torah. As for the Manichaeans, we have seen that they maintained the practice of literary subject. On the contrary, creativity is not so obvious among the Christians. The only library to which we have some access, that of Bulayuk in Turfan, shows copying of manuscripts, translations into Turkish, but hardly anything else. Among the years of the Karaite Christianity established in 1007, the situation described by William of Rubruck 2.5 centuries later is appalling. A corrupt and drunken clergy, ignorant even of the Syriac language, practicing a rudimentary catechism, while enriching its panoply with sorcery practices in order to please the Mongol rulers. But still according to Rubruck, this clergy received a bishop's visit only once in 50 years and had lost contact, which certainly was not the case at Samarkand. All three religions were affected by internal strifes, but in Central Asia, they did not have the same devastating effect they had on the Christian churches of the Near East. Is it because there were less situations of competition in this vast space? And in any case, the political authorities were indifferent. It is indeed remarkable that there is no echo of persecutions between the time of the Arab conquest and the Islamization of Mongol rulers. Although, of course, there was always pressure for conversion. The only vexations recorded by the Bamiyan documents are the fiscal appetites of local agents of the Ghaznavid power and the fire of the Balkh Bazaar in 1006, a collateral damage of the capture of the town by Mahmud of Razna. How did all that finish? The Manichaeans left Central Asia on tiptoe before the end of the 11th century. Their last stronghold was in the coastal regions of southern China, where their trace can be followed until the 17th century. The Nestorian Christians disappeared in the 14th and 15th century. The plague wiped out the communities in the Karluk Empire, and at Samarkand, the Christian perished in a persecution under Ulugh Beg. Christianity returned only with the Russians, and now keeps a low profile. Only the Jews remained constantly, increased by newcomers, but themselves spreading as far as the Mediterranean. Think of all the people today called Bokhara. Some of the Hindu Kush Jews may have gone to China. In the Kaifeng community, which subsists today, some dialectal features and ritual texts once documented among the Bamiyan Jews, have been reported. Since the 1990s, the Central Asian Jews have not seen much of a future in the newly independent republics and have emigrated in mass to Israel and to the United States. Before our eyes unfolds the last episode of a long history of religious coexistence, which, as I hope I have convinced you today, experienced a particularly brilliant phase around year 1000. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Grenet, for a truly fascinating and stimulating lecture. We will now take questions from the audience, please. Yes, we have a question from Hayden over here.
Oh,
May
sorry.
I see the person? Yeah, hello.
Hello. That wasn't a question. I was just indicating some applause for.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No, but I appreciate it. Very fascinating content. Thank you.
Okay, I made a question, if I can, in the chat. I wrote in the chat. So first of all, I thank.
Who is the? Can you give me your name?
Yes, I'm Maria Francesca Melloni, and
Okay.
from the University of Venice. And first of all, thank you for the wonderful lecture. And
so you are speaking from Venice?
Yeah, from Venice. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and I was wondering about the river cults of Central Asia, about which we find a lot of evidences also in an earlier period. If we have some evidence also in the period you talked about, particularly about the Oxus River, the Iranian Bachu.
The Oxus River?
Yeah.
The cult of the Oxus River?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, well, we have continuous evidence. We know now, you know, of course, that a great temple dedicated to the god of the Oxus has been excavated at Tarti-Sanguine. We know the dedication because we have an inscription. This is one of the main pieces of evidence. Personal names formed on Oxus appear in all periods, both in Sogdian and in Bactrian. In Bactrian, there are actually numerous in the Robe archive published by Nicholas Sims-Williams. So it shows, and even in places which were quite distant from the Oxus, such as Robe, which is in the Hindu Kush. So Oxus, Oxus became not only the specific god of the river, but the god of, a god of waters in broad sense. We have also quite many Oxus names in Sogdians and also in Khorezm. Well, in Khorezm, it is not Khorezmia. It is not surprising because the Oxus River is a real structure of the country. Have I answered?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So another question, please.
Can I ask a question, Professor Joski?
Yes, please.
Okay, Professor Grenet, my name is Reza Hosseini, and I'm actually speaking to you from Leiden University. I'm quite happy to see you here, and I'm very happy to hear your lecture. You know, I actually face this kind of multi-religious, you can say, diversity or space in my own PhD dissertation that I'm working on the early Muslim conquest of Bactria, basically. So the question for me is that where this religious tolerance come from? You know, what is the region? Is this because the Central Asia is far away from Iraq and those centers where Christianity and Manichaism and Judaism are there, or something else? So where this actually come from?
Well, it is difficult to answer because, well, basically we have no text which provides the answer, no contemporary text. So we can only make guesses. As you say, distance probably played a role. But the Islamic conquest was very harsh in Central Asia, as you know,
Right.
but it doesn't seem to have been particularly repressive to religious communities. It was harsh to everybody. All Sogdian temples were burnt and plundered, but most probably mainly because they were very rich. Subsequently, I think we can think of several reasons for the relatively peaceful existence of these minorities. First, they were economically important. They were linked to international networks, and the rulers, especially starting in the late 10th century, needed such networks to cash up the spoils of their campaigns. They needed good managers who mastered foreign languages and had international networks. And also, as I said, probably space also is an explanation. In Upper Mesopotamia and Anatolia, you have all these Christian churches, Melkites, Nestorians, Jacobites, fighting each other for the favor of the political masters. They were just clustered. In Central Asia, well, everybody was at ease. There was no overcrowding. We know that they were not only Nestorians, they were Melkites in Chorasmia, for example. But, well, the Nestorians did not bother. They were far away. So they were probably too dispersed to really appear as a threat.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Julian, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My name is Julian, and I have a question about the Buddhism and Zoroastrianism, how long they may have still flourished in some more isolated areas in what is today Afghanistan, or the Afghanistan-Pakistan border area. If we think that Buddhism and probably also Zoroastrianism became extinct in, Bamiyan and Kabul and other areas in Afghanistan by the 10th to 11th century, do you think that in let's say the more isolated areas in Badakhshan and the Pamir Mountains, that Zoroastrianism survived longer, or would it also be extinct, within the next, let's say 100, 200 years?
As in the 11th century, Buddhism survives only on the fringes of Central Asia. It survives in Kashmir, and it survives in Chinese Turkestan and Tibet. There is no evidence of actual Buddhist communities surviving there, although there had been some hypotheses, but I really don't believe it. Buddhism was reintroduced by the Karakitai and the Mongols in the late 12th and 13th century. But this is another story. It was introduced at that time in Iran as well. As for Zoroastrianism, the last testimonies we have, textual, archaeological, I would say belong to the 11th century. Probably they lingered until the Mongol conquest. The last place where there are reports of people calling themselves Zoroastrians is Badakhshan, actually, in the 13th century. There is an article by David Scott on this subject. This is just one record. Perhaps it might be an explanation for the vitality of Ismailism in Badakhshan. Maybe Islamism, in this case, Ismailism as an esoteric trend, developed on the ashes of Zoroastrianism. This is a possibility. But for example, I don't agree with Patricia Crone's idea that most of these sectarian trends in Islam in Central Asia had a Buddhist background. She claims it for the Mukana revolt, for example. She traces it to Mahayana and the cult of Maitreya. I don't believe this is the right explanation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Nikita, please.
Hello, Professor Grenet. Thank you so much for your inspiring lecture. My name is Nikita Kuzmin. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Pennsylvania, but I'm speaking now from Moscow. COVID time. My question is related to the pilgrims. So I remember when you were speaking about Christian Nestorians in Central Asia, you mentioned about inscriptions that they left in caves and this Nestorian cross. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? What was the origin of those pilgrims? Where did they come from? Thank you.
According to him Ibn Hawkal and Istakhri, who give the only independent account, they came from Iraq. But probably this was a minority, and most of them were local, because we have Turkish names, which can be only local. In this cave, they didn't dwell in these caves. You cannot do, they are too small. This was a meditation center. So probably we have inscriptions in small recesses, probably used to, Professor Tardieu thought these were for incubation. People slept there and had dreams, okay? And names were scratched on the cliff, but very discreetly. The church has been found. At the moment, there is no real evidence of a monastery near the church. Maybe there was a monastery somewhere else. The church is not necessarily the monastery church, but this is the only church archaeologists have found. This is all what we can say at the moment, but we have a very, very rich study by Mark Dickens in the journal Studia Iranica, appeared I think 4 years ago, who gives a complete publication and commentary of these inscriptions, with where you'll find all possible answers to your question.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Ron?
Yes, thank you, Frantz, for
Celan.
yes, hello, how are you?
See you again.
Yes, you too. So I have a question that is probably more pedagogical and methodological. So the next year, I am teaching a course on Jews of the Muslim East. And very often when we teach Jewish history, it's very much focused on, well, the Jews. And sometimes in these types of classes, it's hard to even imagine that there were other people around. So my question is really about how to go about thinking about some aspects of this course. Do you think, for example, a comparison to other relatively small religious communities and their experience, let's say around the year 1000, is worthwhile? Or are we talking about a situation whereby it's not really minority religions operating under a more formalized state religion, but rather a different question?
They seem, as I said, they seem to have been well integrated. There is really evidence of close cultural contacts. They read the emerging Persian literature. They put names of Quranic figures in the eulogies. They were certainly not a secluded community. We have, actually, there are two sets of documents from the Babylonian region. The Jewish document, which are all from the early 11th century, Jewish included in the Arabic language, like the Afghan Genizah. And there is a set of Persian and Arab documents later on. And at the moment, due to the circumstances of the discovery, it is not clear at all whether it comes from the same source or not. But it is perfectly possible. And these later documents are not Jew anymore. But it is perfectly possible that they belong to descendants of the earlier Jewish community who had eventually gone to Islam. This is really one possibility. But as I said, what has been published is just the tip of the iceberg, because you know the situation. It is a disaster. The National Library of Israel is trying to acquire as much as possible. Some documents actually are being destroyed because of lack of care, but it seems to be an endless negotiation. But the few publications which have been already made by Shaked and Ophir Haim are excellent, although they don't necessarily agree on all respect. Well, I wouldn't call them a ghetto. Certainly not. They were very much part of their cultural environment. As I said, one member of the family was in Ghazni. Obviously, he was in trade with the court of the Ghaznavids, possibly about the profits of the spoils in India. This is a possibility.
Well, in that course, when we will talk about this, actually Ophir Haim is going to talk to us about all these documents himself. So we will be able to mitigate some of this.
You invite him in Bloomington?
Yes, well, if he is able to come, that's a different story. If not, then...
At least we can be sure he's vaccinated.
Well, and certainly there's Zoom now, so this is also a possibility. Well, I want to thank the entire global audience here for joining us today. And Professor Grenet, you inquired about Professor Beckwith, who is with us. So virtually, let me connect the two of you again. I know you have met before as well. All friends in many different places. So again, thank you so much, Professor Grenet, for a really stimulating lecture. I know that you're also going to be meeting with students on Friday as well. So there'll be more opportunities for questions. Once again, thank you. And I know that the spirit of Denis Sinor is hovering around and would be most delighted at your lecture. So thank you for gracing us today. And we will see you again shortly.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us.